year was 1849, and Missouri was a land in motion. The discovery of gold in California had opened the floodgates of migration. Thousands of hopefuls streamed westward, their wagons rattling along rutted roads, their pockets filled with dreams, and their bellies with little more than salted meat and hard bread. Along the trails that cut through Missouri, inns and way stations flourished. These were havens of rest for weary travelers, places where one might find a hot meal, a bed, and perhaps the company of strangers who carried the same ambitions. Yet, within this landscape of hospitality and commerce, one inn would come to embody something far darker, a place where refuge turned to peril, and where whispers of death lingered long after the fire in the hearth had gone cold. At the center of the tale was a woman who styled herself as a psychic, a seer who claimed she could peer into the hidden chambers of the human mind. Her reputation was half curiosity, half menace. To some, she was merely eccentric, a woman who read the stars and shuffled worn cards for coins. To others, she was uncanny, possessed of a gift that unsettled as much as it fascinated. And in an age when superstition still mingled with faith, when the Bible sat on every shelf but fortune tellers were never far from the imagination, her presence was both tolerated and feared. Her inn sat along a road where traders, prospectors, and wanderers passed in a steady tide. It was not a grand establishment, its roof sagged. Its walls bore the stains of weather and smoke, but it offered shelter at a time when the wilderness outside could kill a man in an evening. Guests reported that the woman welcomed them with strange calmness, her eyes lingering on their faces too long, her words measured and deliberate. Some swore she knew things she could not possibly know, where they had come from, what ailments plagued them, even the secret doubts that weighed on their hearts. At first, these accounts painted her as little more than a curiosity along the trail, a figure to be spoken of in taverns as travelers compared stories. But soon, another kind of tale began to circulate. Men and women who had lodged at the inn were not reaching their destinations. A prospector heading west never arrived in St. Joseph. A peddler bound for the Ozarks vanished between towns, his pack animal found wandering alone. A young couple rumored to have carried savings in a hidden purse was last seen entering the inn's doorway. They were not seen again. It is easy, with hindsight, to dismiss such disappearances as coincidence. After all, the frontier was vast and unforgiving. Illness struck quickly, bandits haunted the roads, and the rivers themselves swallowed the unwary. But the pattern was too sharp to ignore. Each story pointed back to the same roadside inn, the same woman with her fixed stare and her whispered predictions. Rumors hardened into fear, and fear into suspicion. Travelers who survived their nights, their described unsettling moments. Some recalled waking in the dark to find her watching them silently, her figure outlined by lantern light. Others spoke of hearing her muttering to herself in the small hours, words in a language they did not recognize. And still others remembered dreams so vivid, so drenched in dread, that they left the inn certain their minds had been touched by something unnatural. What made the whispers all the more potent was the atmosphere of the times. Missouri in 1849 was a threshold between East and West, between settled communities and the wilderness. Law was fragile, justice slower than the wagons that creaked across the plains. In such places, violence could go unpunished, and strange beliefs could thrive unchecked. People wanted to believe in hidden knowledge, in signs and omens that could steer them safely, but they also feared those who claimed to wield it. The innkeeper lived at that crossroads of geography, of faith, of fear. The true number of those who entered her inn and never emerged will never be known. What remains are fragments, a sheriff's note of investigation, a few lines in a faded newspaper, testimony preserved only in retellings. Yet even in scraps, the tale demands attention, for it is not merely a story of crime, but of how communities wrestled with the unexplainable, how fear of the unknown could shape both rumor and reality. Tonight, as we step into this story, imagine the flicker of lamplight in that dim room, the smell of stew simmering over the fire, the sound of wind pressing against the shutters. Imagine sitting across from a woman whose gaze feels like a weight, who speaks as though she can name the thoughts you hide. Imagine, too, the unease that settles in your stomach when you realize that travelers have come before you. but many have not been seen again. This is the story of the psychic innkeeper of Missouri, whose name remains a whisper and whose deeds straddle the line between legend and fact. Her inn promised safety but delivered silence, and the silence, even now, still clings to the hillsides where her guests vanished. The United States in the mid-19th century was a land still being carved out of wilderness, a nation expanding westward with restless determination. Missouri, lying just beyond the Mississippi River, became one of the gateways to this expansion. It was not merely a state, but a threshold into the unknown, a place where civilization frayed at the edges and law traveled slower than rumor. The year 1849 was one of upheaval. The California gold rush had sent waves of fortune seekers across the continent, and Missouri stood as one of the central departure points. The rivers, dusty roads, and makeshift trails were alive with movement. Wagons rolled westward, inns and taverns filled with migrants, and whispers of opportunity swelled alongside darker murmurings of danger. It was a time of tension between old-world superstition and the emerging rationality of a modernizing society. Newspapers carried reports of industrial growth in the East, yet in the heartlands, belief in spirits, omens, and the unseen world remained deeply rooted. A psychic, or at least someone claiming such powers, could still command attention, especially among weary travelers and farmers who longed for guidance or warning. This cultural backdrop created fertile ground for figures who blurred the line between healer, mystic, and fraud. The public fascination with seers was undeniable, and in Missouri, one innkeeper became both a beneficiary and a monster within this atmosphere of trust and fear. The inn sat near a rural crossroads, the kind of place where wagon wheels groaned and horses snorted before their riders sought warmth and food. Such establishments were common, their wooden frames thrown together quickly, offering straw-filled mattresses and simple meals for a few coins. Yet in Missouri, these inns were more than just stopping points. They were nodes in a fragile web of community. Travelers shared tales around firelight, locals gathered to exchange news, and strangers rested briefly before disappearing into the westward expanse. In this climate, innkeepers held an unusual power. They were custodians of stories, guardians of hospitality, and sometimes, as whispered in hindsight, predators disguised in the robes of service. The year 1849 was also one of calamity. Cholera ravaged Missouri as thousands of migrants passed through. Reports tell of towns where entire families perished within days, rivers choked with corpses, and fear of contagion spreading as fast as the disease itself. Death was not an abstraction. It was present in every household, pressing against every door. This environment blurred boundaries between rational medicine and supernatural explanations. When physicians failed, people turned to seers, spiritualists, or anyone who promised to pierce the veil of fate. An innkeeper with psychic claims would not have seemed out of place, but rather a source of reassurance until that trust was betrayed. Missouri's social fabric was stretched thin by slavery debates, border tensions, and the relentless churn of migration. The state had entered the Union as a slave state in 1821, and by 1849, it remained divided between free soil advocates and defenders of the institution. Violence simmered beneath the surface, especially in rural communities where distrust and secrecy governed daily life. Travelers were outsiders, sometimes welcomed, sometimes resented, often seen as opportunities. Against this charged backdrop, stories of disappearances were easy to dismiss. A missing traveler might have simply moved on westward, fallen sick, or joined a wagon train without notice. Few would have considered darker explanations, at least not openly. The economy of inns and taverns was built on impermanence. Guests rarely stayed long enough to form bonds. They left no footprints except for their coin. This anonymity shielded the innkeeper who operated in Missouri's shadowed corners. A guest could arrive with hopes of fortune, vanish into the fog of the frontier, and no one would raise questions for months, perhaps years. Families back east might never know whether their loved ones fell to disease, accident, or foul play. In this sense, the very structure of society in 1849, the transience, the looseness of community ties, the vast distances made the perfect breeding ground for predators. At the same time, there was a fascination with crime and the macabre in the popular press. Newspapers sensationalized murders, robberies, and strange deaths, blending fact with rumor to capture readers' imaginations. Tales of haunted houses, spectral warnings, and uncanny visions were published alongside reports of robber gangs and frontier shootouts. In this way, the idea of a psychic innkeeper who murdered guests would have landed at the intersection of two obsessions: the growing taste for true crime stories and the enduring allure of the supernatural. Missouri, with its reputation as both crossroads and battleground, lent credibility to such chilling legends. Cultural practices in rural Missouri also contributed to the weight of superstition. Folk remedies, charms, and spiritual guidance often took precedence over official medicine. Communities blended European traditions with local lore, creating a tapestry of beliefs in which the psychic innkeeper could thrive. The act of divination, reading palms, interpreting dreams, or sensing omens was not merely entertainment but part of survival in uncertain times. To trust a psychic was, in some ways, to place hope against the chaos of a violent and unpredictable world. But it was a fragile trust, and when it collapsed, it left scars not only on individuals, but on the memory of an entire community. By situating the tale within 1849 Missouri, the story of the psychic innkeeper becomes more than a grotesque account of murder. It becomes a window into the cultural and historical fabric of a society caught between past and future. It speaks to the anxieties of migration, the desperation of disease, the hunger for meaning, and the vulnerabilities of trust. The hills of Missouri held not only farms and cabins, but secrets, some whispered by wind through trees, others etched into the very soil where travelers disappeared without trace. In this world, every inn was a question mark, every psychic reading a gamble, and every traveler's last step into the dimly lit common room of a rural inn could mean either safety or oblivion. The historical stage was set, the atmosphere charged. Out of this turbulent landscape emerged the innkeeper, whose legend still haunts the imagination, a figure who turned hospitality into entrapment and faith into a weapon. The innkeeper was, by outward appearances, unremarkable. A wiry man with narrow eyes and a soft voice, he wore the expression of someone who always seemed to be listening for something others could not hear. Neighbors whispered that he was gifted with sight beyond the natural visions that drifted into him like smoke. He would predict storms before clouds gathered, name travelers who would arrive before wagon wheels cracked the road, and offer vague warnings that seemed to sharpen only after disaster struck. Some called him a seer, others called him a fraud. But in 1849 Missouri, both labels carried weight, and both could draw desperate strangers to his inn. The first stories of unease centered on the way guests vanished after staying under his roof. At first, no one noticed. Travelers were nameless to the community, their arrivals and departures barely noted. Yet a pattern emerged: men on their way to the California gold fields, women traveling alone after losing families to cholera. Small groups who stopped for rest all seemed to disappear between one night's supper and the next morning's road. It might have remained unnoticed, but whispers grew louder when personal belongings began to surface. A gold watch that belonged to a man from Ohio. A bonnet remembered on the head of a young woman last seen stepping into the inn. A set of boots too fine for a local farmer. The hills themselves seemed to be swallowing people whole, but the psychic innkeeper's shadow stretched long across the rumors. He kept his inn dimly lit with candles that threw more shadows than light. Guests spoke of the strange atmosphere, how the air felt colder near the hearth, how he asked too many questions about their families and their wealth, how his eyes lingered too long when they spoke of gold or inheritance. And then there was the ritual. Before bed, he would offer to read their future, sometimes by staring into water, sometimes by holding their hands as though feeling the pulse of destiny in their veins. Those who agreed often spoke of a peculiar sensation, a sudden heaviness, as if the air itself pressed down on them. Some never woke after those sessions. Locals recalled hearing the sounds that followed these readings: a sharp thud in the night, a dragging across the wooden floors, the muffled cry cut off too quickly. No one dared to investigate. In 1849, Missouri suspicion was a dangerous burden. To accuse an innkeeper, respected for offering shelter and food, was to risk community wrath. Instead, people turned away, convincing themselves that travelers had moved on, or that ghosts of the cholera dead were responsible for the noises. Silence was safer than inquiry. The innkeeper's methods, reconstructed from fragments of testimony, were as chilling as they were efficient. A guest would sit in the parlor, hands placed on the rough table where he conducted his psychic rites. The innkeeper would lower his voice, murmuring words no one else could hear. Then, with an almost priestly calm, he would signal for the guest to lean closer. The blow that followed was sudden, an iron poker swung from behind, or a blade hidden beneath the table. In some versions of the tale, a trapdoor opened beneath the chair, sending victims tumbling into a cellar. There, the innkeeper finished what he had begun, the echo of steel against bone carried into the soil. Bodies were never buried deep. Missouri's soil was hard and graves shallow. Dogs were said to have brought back bones to nearby farms, gnawed clean and stripped of flesh. When asked, the innkeeper claimed they were animal remains, discarded after butchering livestock. Yet the bones bore the unmistakable shape of human joints, the hollow orbits of skulls. Few pressed the matter further. The frontier taught people to live with silence and suspicion, to ignore what their eyes whispered. But silence does not erase unease, it magnifies it. Chilling stories grew around the food he served. Travelers noticed the peculiar taste of his stews, the stringiness of the meat, the way he never seemed to slaughter livestock yet always had cuts to serve. Farmers recalled that he bought little from the market, yet the pot on his hearth was always full. Rumors of cannibalism began to seep into the gossip, quiet at first, then louder when families swore that their kin had vanished near his inn. He deflected with a serene smile, claiming visions guided him to provisions provided by fate. The explanation, couched in mysticism, did little to ease suspicion. The psychic rituals became darker in memory, as though the community retrospectively painted them in blood. Some spoke of how he would chant over a bowl of water until the surface rippled as though stirred by unseen hands. Others swore he used bones long, pale, unmistakably human, as charms hidden in the rafters. One neighbor claimed to have seen him standing barefoot in the frost, eyes rolled back, whispering to the hills. The Missouri frontier was fertile ground for superstition, but these stories carried a weight that pressed on the chest of anyone who heard them. Disappearance piled upon disappearance. A merchant carrying silks never made it to St. Louis. A pair of brothers heading west were last seen tying their horses outside the inn. A widow traveling with her young maid was reported missing, her belongings later spotted in the innkeeper's possession. Each case fed the growing unease, though still no one acted. Fear, after all, is a leash stronger than rope. When cholera reached the area in 1849, its devastation provided cover for the innkeeper's growing trail of death. Families lost whole households overnight and bodies piled high in shallow graves. In such a climate, who would count missing travelers? Who would separate plague victims from those who simply vanished? Death was everywhere, and the innkeeper's victims dissolved into that fog of tragedy. Yet still, the unease lingered. Some neighbors claimed to hear screams carried on the wind at night, the kind that were too sharp, too human to be mistaken for coyotes. Others told of dreams filled with the sound of dripping water and the sensation of being watched from the hills. Eventually, suspicion began to pierce the silence. A traveler who escaped the inn spoke of a narrow escape of a reading interrupted when he noticed the innkeeper's hand clutching a hidden blade. He fled into the night, never looking back, but his words spread quickly. Soon, more survivors surfaced. A man who claimed he had been drugged by the innkeeper's stew. A woman who recalled waking in the cellar with bones scattered around her. The accounts varied, but the pattern was undeniable. Missouri's haunted inn was no longer whispered about as superstition. It was spoken of as fact. As the stories reached newspapers, the innkeeper's legend grew monstrous. Journalists, eager for sensational tales, painted him as a frontier demon who devoured travelers. Some compared him to old-world tales of vampires and witches. Others framed him as the embodiment of frontier fear, the darkness that lurked where law had not yet settled. His psychic claims, once a curiosity, became evidence of devilry, proof that his visions came not from heaven, but from the abyss. Yet even as the rumors hardened into a narrative, the truth remained elusive. How many vanished within his walls? How many were buried in shallow graves behind the inn? No ledger survived. No testimony was recorded with legal weight. Only bones scattered in fields, belongings too fine for poor farmers, and a silence that stretched far beyond the hills. The insidious power of the innkeeper's story lies not in what is confirmed, but in what can never be fully known. Travelers feared him, yet were drawn to him. Neighbors whispered, yet did nothing. The land itself seemed to conspire with him, holding its secrets tight. Missouri soil, damp with river fog and thick with decay, swallowed the evidence of his crimes, leaving only fragments to feed the imagination. And so, the insidious incidents continued, blending history with horror. The innkeeper's legacy became one of shadow half seen, half believed, yet impossible to shake. Each disappearance was a new stone on the cairn of his legend, each survivor's tale another drop in the well of dread. To enter his inn was to gamble with fate itself, to sit across the table from a man who claimed to see the future, yet offered only death. The first whispers were carried not by the newspapers, but by neighbors who lived close enough to hear the unease of the inn's walls. Farmers passing along the road began to avoid the place after dusk, claiming the air seemed heavier, as if silence itself pressed on their shoulders. Women drawing water from nearby wells whispered that they saw shapes in the trees at night, shapes that did not belong to animals. For years, the unease stayed quiet, hidden behind the mask of frontier stoicism. But unease grows restless when left unspoken. By the summer of 1849, it had become impossible to ignore. Survivors' testimonies began to spread, first as rumor, then as warning. A merchant, pale with terror, told of how he escaped through a window after being offered stew that smelled faintly of iron. A woman, shivering in recollection, swore that she awoke in the cellar to find bones scattered around her, gnawed clean, before clawing her way to freedom. These were not the stories of restless children or overactive imaginations. These were sober, trembling recollections of adults who had walked the fine edge between life and death. The local clergy found themselves pressed into uneasy roles. Pastors were asked to explain how a man could claim the power of visions yet walk in such darkness. Some argued that he was a fraud, exploiting superstition for profit. Others warned that his powers might be demonic, that Missouri's soil itself was cursed by the sins of men. In Sunday sermons, his name was not always spoken, but the warnings were clear. Evil walked the land, and its disguise was hospitality. Doctors, too, weighed in, though medicine in 1849 was fragile at best. Some suggested the innkeeper might have used herbs or toxins to weaken his victims, masking the effects as spiritual trances. The cholera epidemic had trained the public to accept sudden collapse as part of life, but in these stories, collapse came not from sickness but from malice. To physicians, the line between poisoning and disease blurred, yet the pattern of disappearances was too deliberate to dismiss. What science could not fully explain, fear readily embraced. The press played its part with relish. Newspapers in Missouri and beyond began printing lurid accounts, blending fact and rumor until the distinction frayed. The Haunted Inn of Missouri, one headline read, accompanied by sketches of shadowed rooms and dripping cellars. Some journalists accused him outright of murder. Others described him as a folk demon, a phantom innkeeper who lured travelers into death. Each article inflamed the imagination of readers already fascinated by tales of crime and supernatural horror, and with every story, the legend grew more monstrous. Neighbors who had once tolerated the man's eccentricities now spoke of him as though they had always known. They recalled seeing him dig in the dead of night, dragging bundles into the earth. They remembered bones found on their land, dismissed too quickly as animal remains. They confessed to hearing screams, but convincing themselves they were nothing more than foxes or owls. In hindsight, every detail became part of the case against him, a collective confession of silence too long maintained, yet not all believed. Some insisted the tales were exaggerations, born from fear and hysteria. The gold rush had made people restless, eager for stories of horror to match the fever of opportunity. Was it possible, skeptics asked, that the missing travelers had simply gone west and vanished into the chaos of migration? Could the tales of bones and blood be nothing more than frontier folklore, embroidered in retelling? Even in the heart of suspicion, doubt remained. After all, no one had caught him in the act. But fear is not softened by doubt. Fear moves communities like a shadow. Families began to lock their doors earlier. Travelers avoided the inn, sometimes even refusing to pass by on the road. Some swore they saw figures wandering near the building at night, pale, silent, restless souls who had once been guests. Folklore and reality merged until one could not be separated from the other. The inn was not simply a building, it became a wound in the land, a reminder of how easily trust could become a trap. The debate spilled into households and taverns. Fathers warned sons not to wander near the inn. Mothers hushed children with stories of the psychic innkeeper, half myth, half monster, his gaze able to pierce through walls. Communities wrestled with their complicity. Had they ignored too much for too long? Had their silence allowed horror to thrive? These questions lingered in the air, uncomfortable and unanswerable. Even years later, when the inn fell into disrepair, the reactions of the community did not fade. Farmers plowed around the land but refused to build upon it. Children dared each other to touch the inn's door, only to run shrieking at the creak of its hinges. Newspapers occasionally resurrected the story, each time layering new details onto the legend. The innkeeper's name became less important than his role in the collective memory. The man who turned trust into murder, who transformed the frontier, dream into nightmare. The reactions were not confined to fear alone. There was also fascination. Just as people shuddered at his deeds, they could not stop speaking of them. The story became a cautionary tale, a fireside narrative, a warning woven into the fabric of Missouri folklore. Travelers who passed through the state heard it repeated in hushed tones: beware the roads at night, beware the inn with too many shadows, beware the host who promises to see your future. In this way, the community itself became the carrier of his legend, ensuring that his memory outlived the walls of his inn. What is most revealing is not merely how the community reacted, but how they remembered. Memory blurred the edges of fact and rumor, but the fear remained sharp. To this day, the story of the psychic innkeeper is less about one man's crimes than about a community's reckoning with its silence, its superstition, and its vulnerability. In 1849, Missouri, horror did not simply dwell in the hills. It lived in the minds of those who survived, shaping how they spoke, how they trusted, and how they told their history. Night had fallen heavy on the Missouri hills, the kind of darkness that pressed down like a weight, thickened by fog and silence. The inn stood alone against it, a dim lantern flickering in its single front window, swaying as if undecided whether to fight the dark or surrender to it. By then, rumors had grown into something unbearable: screams carried on the wind, bones turning up where they should not, belongings of the missing surfacing in plain sight. Suspicion had finally sharpened into resolve. A group of townsfolk gathered at the edge of the road, each carrying a lantern, some armed with rifles, others with little more than farm tools, and all with dread in their throats. They had come not for justice in the legal sense, but for confrontation, for answers no one else seemed willing to demand. For weeks they had debated whether the stories were true. Now the unease in their hearts had turned to certainty, because too many faces were gone, too many names unaccounted for. The innkeeper's gift of foresight, once a curiosity, now looked like knowledge born of guilt. Who could predict so much? Death, unless he was the one who dealt it? The innkeeper greeted them as though expecting company. His face broke into that familiar, unsettling smile, thin, knowing, as if he had seen their gathering long before they decided to come. His voice was calm, inviting them in from the chill night, offering hot broth from the pot on the hearth. Yet the sight of the stew only hardened their resolve. Too many had wondered what floated in that dark broth, what meat he simmered in endless supply without ever slaughtering livestock. One man, braver or more desperate than the rest, pushed past him into the main room. The lantern light cast long shadows, revealing the wooden table scarred with knife marks, the heavy chair placed at its head. It was here, survivors claimed, that the readings took place where a traveler's palm would be held, their future whispered, before silence fell forever. The others followed, their eyes darting to every corner as though the walls themselves held breath. The cellar door was what drew them, a simple trapdoor, half hidden beneath a rug. When one man tugged it open, the smell rose immediately, thick and coppery, clinging to the throat. The lanterns lowered, trembling light spilling into the dark below, revealed what the whispers had only suggested. Bones, piles of them. Some stacked neatly as though sorted, others scattered in grotesque disarray, gnawed, splintered. Skulls stared back with empty sockets, mute witnesses to nights of terror. Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped his lantern, nearly snuffing the light. Another man crossed himself repeatedly, muttering prayers under his breath. The women among them covered their mouths, some retching, others crying out. It was no longer rumor, no longer folklore, it was fact carved in bone and shadow. The innkeeper did not flinch. Instead, he lowered his eyes and spoke softly, claiming the bones had spoken to him, that spirits demanded sacrifice, that he had only obeyed what was shown in his visions. His words, meant to explain, only deepened the horror, madness or malevolence. No one could decide which, but either way, it was enough. The confrontation spiraled into chaos. Some wanted to seize him immediately, drag him into town, place him before the law. Others, trembling with rage, wanted blood then and there. The innkeeper, sensing the shift, backed away, his calm cracking. His voice rose, shrill now, insisting. They did not understand that the hills demanded tribute, that without him, worse horrors would come. His words fell like stones into a well swallowed by the fury of those around him. When they advanced, he lashed out, striking with a blade hidden at his side. The first man fell, wounded, but not killed, his cry igniting the rest into action. Rifles were raised, though none dared fire in such close quarters. Instead, they surged forward as one, overpowering him with the weight of their fury. The struggle was brutal shouts, grunts, the clatter of overturned furniture. The lantern lights swung wildly, painting the walls in frantic shadows. Finally, the innkeeper was subdued, bound with ropes meant for livestock, dragged into the main room as his victims once had been. He screamed then, not words of repentance, but curses, prophecies of doom, visions of plague and fire, warnings that their children's children would remember his name. His eyes gleamed with a terrible conviction, as if even in defeat he believed himself chosen, ordained by something greater than human law. They held him through the night, guarding him in silence while the stew pot cooled and the bones in the cellar lay uncovered for the first time. By dawn, the decision was clear. The law would take him, but the law would not erase what they had seen. Too many bones, too many vanished lives. The innkeeper had been a host of death, and his inn a shrine to silence. The climax of that night did not end with his capture alone. For weeks afterward, families from surrounding counties came to peer into the cellar, to whisper over the remains, to wonder if their missing kin lay among the dead. The inn stood open, its secrets bared, every creak of its boards a reminder of the horrors hidden in plain sight. The community's silence had broken, but too late for the countless who had stepped through that door never to return. In the collective memory of Missouri, that night was remembered not only for the confrontation, but for the terrible stillness that followed. The innkeeper had been dragged away, but his presence lingered. People swore that the house remained haunted not by ghosts of the victims alone, but by the man himself, his curses echoing in the rafters, his shadow flickering in the candlelight. The inn became a ruin, avoided, feared, yet never forgotten. It was the climax of a story that had begun with whispers and ended in undeniable truth, a truth carved in bone, sealed in silence, and carried forever by those who had seen the cellar with their own eyes. The inn no longer stands. The walls rotted, the roof collapsed, and in time, the land reclaimed what was left. Yet its shadow never left Missouri's memory. Those who lived through that winter carried with them a silence heavier than words could bear. They had seen the bones, they had smelled the truth, and they had heard the innkeeper's voice, shrieking prophecies that still rattled in their dreams. In the years that followed, the site became something more than abandoned ground. Some said they avoided it because of the stench that lingered, long after the cellar was emptied. Others claimed the soil itself refused to grow crops, as though the earth had swallowed too much blood to ever be fertile again. Children dared one another to walk near the ruins, reporting cold winds and whispers that rose from nowhere. Farmers who passed by at dusk swore they saw lantern light in the window of a house no longer there. The innkeeper himself did not meet a heroic end. Records say he was brought before the court, his crimes listed in painstaking detail. Witnesses spoke of the cellar, of the bones, of the knives stained with what could no longer be denied. Yet even then, he remained unrepentant. He told the judge that he had only obeyed visions sent to him, that he had been chosen as a vessel for forces too vast for ordinary men to understand. When sentenced to death, he laughed. Some said he whispered as the noose tightened, not a prayer but a warning. This is not the end. You will see me again. What followed was not just punishment but legend. The trial became the talk of surrounding towns, reprinted in newspapers that could barely capture the strangeness of it all. Spiritualists seized upon the story, claiming, the innkeeper was proof of a deeper world, a man who touched the veil between life and death, but became trapped in its shadows. Religious leaders condemned him as a servant of evil, while skeptics dismissed the psychic element entirely, calling him no more than a murderer who cloaked cruelty and prophecy. And yet the strange detail lingered: the accuracy of his predictions. Some townsfolk remembered nights when he foretold storms that arrived within hours, illnesses that struck households exactly as he described, deaths that unfolded almost word for word as he had whispered. If he was only a fraud, how had he known so much? If he was a true seer, what price had he paid for such knowledge? Generations debated, each side clinging to their interpretation. But the unease never faded. Even after his execution, travelers disappeared on lonely roads nearby. Even after the inn crumbled, people still heard phantom footsteps when the fog grew thick. The hills of Missouri seemed stained by a memory that time refused to wash away. The story came to embody more than crime. It became a mirror. Some saw in it the danger of unchecked superstition, how fascination with the mystical blinded a community until it was too late. Others read it as a warning of human darkness, the hunger that can hide behind charm, hospitality, even visions of the future. And for many, it remained a tale of the uncanny, proof that not all mysteries can be explained by courts or laws or even reason. Families of the missing never found closure. Bones were bones, but without names, they remained unfinished grief. Mothers buried fragments with prayers. Brothers carved markers on empty graves. The ache of the unknown became its own kind of haunting, heavier than ghosts. To this day, stories persist of the innkeeper's presence. Campfire tales tell of a figure in tattered clothes walking the road at night, offering shelter to weary travelers. Those who accept, the legend warns, are never seen again. Paranormal investigators claim the land hums with energy, their instruments spiking near the place where the cellar once gaped open. Skeptics dismiss it all, but the folklore grows, carrying his name further than he ever walked in life. What lingers most is the silence. The silence of neighbors who once dined at his table, who once laughed at his predictions, who once trusted him. The silence of a town that realized too late it had looked into darkness and mistaken it for wisdom, and the silence of the earth itself, holding secrets it will never release. History marks 1849 as the year Missouri brushed against something that felt larger than crime, deeper than madness. A year when an innkeeper saw the future and turned it into death. A year when fear and fascination collided, and the price was counted in bones. The truth of who he was, prophet, murderer, madman, or pawn of something unseen, remains out of reach. But that is the nature of such stories. They refuse to end neatly. They linger, gnawing at the edges of certainty, leaving only questions. And so, as night falls over the hills, as fog curls across the old road, one thought remains. Some doors, once opened, never truly close.